History 398 bloopers.
Okay, so I'm presenting Chris Klein's thesis, which is about Gerald Ford and his role in the Helsinki Accords. His perspective title for his thesis project is The Promises We Keep, Gerald Ford, Ethics-Based Leadership, and the Helsinki Accords. What I gathered from his prospectus is that his main goals are that he hopes to discover more about a man that was often overlooked when he seems to be exactly the kind of leader that the nation was yearning for in the aftermath of Vietnam and then Nixon and Watergate. Chris hopes to prove that Ford was a strong leader who applied his character and his impeccable ethics to the job of president, which was a job that he never wanted. Chris also wishes to learn how his character affected the relationship between the two most powerful nations ever, being the United States and the Soviet Union. Chris looks to find out whether a plain-speaking, honest leader was able to deal better with the Soviets than a politician that had to answer to campaign promises. And then more specifically regarding the Helsinki Conference, which I'm about to talk about, did Ford realize exactly what kind of impact the human rights components of the Helsinki Conference would have? And how was Ford's leadership perceived at the time by Congress, the media, and the public? And what was really at stake in the Helsinki Conference for Ford's future, political and otherwise? So a little bit of background information on the Helsinki Accords. This is coming straight from Wikipedia because I wanted to provide the class with a little bit of background information on what the Helsinki Accords are, as well as providing myself with a little bit of additional background information about the Helsinki Accords. So the Helsinki Accords, which is also known as the Helsinki Final Act or the Helsinki Declaration, was the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was held in Helsinki, Finland during July and August of 1975. 33 states, including the USA and Canada and most European states, with the exception of Albania and Andorra, signed a declaration in an attempt to improve relations between the Communist bloc and the West. However, the Helsinki Accords were not binding and they didn't have any treaty status, so it was a strictly symbolic, treaty, a symbolic accord. And a lot of people in America didn't like the symbolic nature of it and thought that it lacked substance. And that's a lot of the criticism that Ford received for the Accords, and it's a lot of what Chris's thesis will be addressing. Moving on to Chris's historiography, and I'll just briefly go over a few of the works that Chris has examined for us. Starting with Ford's autobiography, A Time to Heal, where Ford defends himself and his leadership at Helsinki. And the book also features an interesting story about Ford and explaining his justification of meeting with the Soviets to a group of Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian Americans who would take particular exception with this meeting because of the alleged human rights violations that were occurring in those Baltic countries during the Soviet reign and at the time of the Helsinki Conference. And a biography of Gerald Ford that he plans on looking at in contrast of A Time to Heal, which was Ford's autobiography himself and took a more positive light, is John R. Green's The Presidency of Gerald R. Ford. In the book, Green claims that Ford led with integrity but was not the visionary leader that a lot of people give him the credit of being, for two main reasons. The first one being that the means in which he the means in which he took office, which was in the wake of a giant scandal and not through direct election, didn't allow him to have enough time to create his vision. And secondly, in his past political career as a congressman, he was never required to have his own political vision. He would just piggyback on the vision of the Republican Party. Another source that Chris plans on using is Jussi Hadji's,
good luck with that.
Yeah, The Flawed Architect, Henry Kissinger in American Foreign Policy, in which the author argues that Kissinger was actually the visionary in the Helsinki Accords. Another work is Janek Magdziewski, another name I can't pronounce. His book, Gerald Ford and the Challenges of the 1970s, which was written in 2005, I believe. So 30 years after Ford's presidency. So it provides us with some perspective years later on the Ford presidency and on Helsinki. And all in all, it concludes that Ford led with a visionary philosophy and was a really important visionary leader and human rights activist, proved by his role at Helsinki. I'm going to skip forward through the rest of the historiography to save time because I have a little bit more to get to. I'll come back if there's more time at the end. Chris met with Professor Wisnowskis, who's going to be his advisor. He met with him, I think it was either yesterday or the day before, for the first time. And Chris said that...
It wasn't the first.
Oh, not for the first time.
First time, like as formally as advisor.
Oh, for the first time formally as advisor. Okay.
Not to cut you off.
It's okay. So he met with him this week and was able to get some additional direction on his thesis. So the focus of Chris's thesis will still be on Ford's leadership at Helsinki, but I think that what Professor Wisnowskis did was help Chris sort of outline his thesis a little bit more efficiently. Since visiting with Wisnowskis, Chris has decided that his thesis will spend less time looking at what vision Ford had and more time focusing on what factors led Ford to the Helsinki Accords and what the political fallout was. So in Chapter 1, he'll look at Ford's foreign policy record as a congressman, and specifically his views on the Soviets and on the Cold War. Chapter 2 is going to focus on the Helsinki Conference itself, or the Helsinki Accords itself, and Ford's role in it. And Chris will look to see how much Ford impacted it and how much Kissinger impacted it. And Chapter 3 will look at the primary fallout from Helsinki, how the media portrayed it, how it impacted Reagan's primary challenge to Ford, and the 1976 Ford-Carter election, in which Ford lost to Jimmy Carter. And then in his conclusion, he'll determine how large of an impact Ford had on Helsinki when it was all said and done, and see what sort of impact it ultimately had on the 1976 election, and, I'd hope, on the Cold War at large. So I could go back and present more of the historiography, or I could wrap it here, but we'll wrap it here. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job explaining everything, and as you guys all know, my thesis is I have done all the research. It's just trying to find the way to frame it appropriately and trying to find a way to best organize it. I originally was drawn to Ford, because as I told many of you, because I grew up going to the Ford Museum in Grand Rapids often. And I thought, why is it that my parents and other people at this museum are the only people who like this guy? Everyone else is not giving this sort of any credit. In my history textbook, they made fun of him for changing Hail to the Chief to the Victors. I thought that was the coolest thing ever, that he put the Victors as his own theme song everywhere he went. And so I really wanted to write a thesis that would make him look better. And originally the idea was that I was going to try to show that he had a grand vision. And as I've done more research, I realized that while that's a possibility, it's more that it's not necessarily has this huge vision of changing the world, kind of like Sam was saying with Jefferson, but more that he has these values that he applies, and that he has this idea of what kind of leader a president should be that I think is very revolutionary, and that might be sort of a vision in its own sense. And so that was what I'd really been toying with, and I obviously I've always been drawn to Helsinki, so from the start it's been Ford and Helsinki, but exactly what framework would I be looking at? Would I be looking at Ford's background leading to Helsinki? Would I be looking at Helsinki afterwards? And those were the two angles I was really pursuing, and I had done research accordingly up until this point. So I had done research on Helsinki, the Helsinki Accords, and the effects thereafter. I had done some research on Ford's background leading up to Helsinki, and what I really wanted to meet with Professor Vanaskis to discuss was which of these was a better avenue. Because going back to freshman year, he's someone who always helped me frame my papers much better. I originally was going to write a massive paper on just Lincoln and Jefferson Davis during the Civil War, and he helped me frame it down to a very specific comparison of Davis and Lincoln on just one issue. And I asked him to do a similar thing here as my advisor, and he was able to kind of point me in the direction of looking at Ford's congressional record and looking at how he represented Grand Rapids, Michigan's 5th District, and seeing how he was kind of a bit of a Cold War hawk, which I've obviously done the research accordingly for that. And how does that impact his decision to act at Helsinki? Because Helsinki often can be seen as a betrayal on that. And actually, what's interesting is Ford was a moderate Republican, and the 76 challenge from Reagan was from the right of the Republican Party, and then fighting Carter, obviously, was on the left. So Helsinki was unpopular both on the right and the left. So electorally and politically, why did Ford do what he did? It seems like a strange move, and that's what's always intrigued me, because I like his values, and I believe he did something with conviction. And I really like the idea of a politician not necessarily considering the political implications in the short term, but looking at things in a larger, bigger American perspective. And so, like I said, maybe that's the vision, maybe that's not a vision, but what I want to look at is how are Ford's values impacting that, and then what was the effect afterwards when he pursued a policy that he believed was right and just. So yeah, any questions I can handle for all you guys? What's up?
I guess, like, you obviously really like Ford.
Yeah, he's my boy. I do.
I kind of guessed that so far, and I guess I was just wondering, like, are you at all worried about bias being in your paper?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I mean, that's, like I said, I'm absolutely concerned about that. And I should say I'll be examining the effects of Kissinger as well in Helsinki. And there's a very distinct possibility that his impact on Helsinki will be less than I've heretofore realized. But I said the goal is to look and see if I believe he has strong values. I want to prove that. So that is obviously a goal of the thesis, but if the evidence isn't there, I have to show that maybe he had a smaller impact on Helsinki than I thought. But he undoubtedly had an impact. He undoubtedly impacted the '76 election. It undoubtedly was one of the reasons why Reagan challenged him, his foreign policy towards Ford's foreign policy towards the Soviets. And so those will all still be relevant, but it will be a challenge, and I certainly will be prepared. That's, like I said, one of the reasons why I wanted Professor Vanaskis is he also likes Ford and is able to look through things without the rose-colored glasses. I apologize. And so I think he'll be someone who can help me ensure that I don't let my bias get in the way of that. Grace.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I'm starting the Republican Party at kind of a similar time, like really right before that.
Yeah.
Do you think that how far back are you going to go, kind of? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
how much are you studying just the world that Ford lived in versus the world that was sort of created by the time he came in?
Yeah.
Are you going to study Watergate? Are you going to...
Not going to focus on Watergate a ton. Obviously I would love to do that. And 20th century American history is about as good as it gets. But I'm going to look mostly at Ford. But at the same time, Ford, so he gets elected in 1948. After serving World War II, he gets elected to the House of Representatives in 1948. And then he becomes minority leader in 1965, if I remember correctly. So he's in the House of Representatives from the late 1940s. So I have to understand at least some background knowledge of the American 1950s and 60s because, Ford, this doesn't directly relate to my thesis, but it's still important. He served on the, I can't remember what they're called off the top of my head, but the committee that looked at what exactly went down the JFK assassination. He served on the committee that created NASA. Like, he was there for so many key parts of the 1950s and 60s, and because, again, he's leading the Republican Party at the time, so I have to understand that base level. But I'm going to look at it from Ford's perspective. It just so happens that the guy led the Republican Party in the House of Representatives for 8 years, from mid-1960s to until you assume the vice presidency. So you can't really escape a lot of the background things because he's such a key important player in that.
Cool.
I remember Johnson called him into to his office along with other leaders and pretended to listen to him because he had to listen to some Republican leader, and because he obviously didn't care to ask about Vietnam policy. And Ford said, at the time, this is 64, 65, he goes, if you do not pursue a more aggressive policy in Vietnam, if you pursue gradual escalation, the country will grow tired of it, they will turn against you and blame you for it. He said, you either have to not enter this at all, which Ford did not advocate. Obviously, he's a Republican, so he's even more to the right on this. But he said, or you can go all in and really pursue this war hard from the start. and be honest with the American people and tell them what sort of a commitment it would take to win. And he said that was the way. And so he basically saw Johnson's problems. So like I said, so the Vietnam is a little bit relevant here too. It doesn't directly relate to Helsinki, obviously, but you got to understand these things to get his values, to understand what made Ford tick, what did he do for 25 years in the House of Representatives, to then go and turn to the Helsinki Accords, to understand like his political background, to get what led him to do this decision, and then obviously see what happened with his election afterwards.
Yeah, a lot of your thesis is kind of, a vindication of Ford, and you're saying how it's been overlooked in history. Was he overlooked during his presidency? Were we writing him off like while he was in office, or is this kind of a product of Reagan coming in afterwards and kind of changing the modern view of conservatism?
He's so overlooked that both are at play here. Honestly, yeah, he's at the time he was sort of regarded as. He was the person who was not originally Nixon's vice president. He becomes Nixon's vice president. He then becomes the president. It's like no one elected this guy. Everybody loves him. He's the greatest guy ever. Everyone gets a kick out of him. But I mean, he's lampooned on Saturday Night Live. He's only in office for 2.5 years. So a lot of people say, oh, there's 800 days in between Nixon and Carter, and then they move on. So that was sort of the way at the time. And then afterwards, he was challenged by Reagan in 1976. Reagan almost beat him. I don't remember the exact electoral count, but I remember Ford won 27 primaries, Reagan won 23. So people already are liking this, Ford was a moderate Republican, and Reagan was obviously the new conservative wave, so absolutely Reagan kind of swings in, and people just instantly overlook Ford. But like a lot of people forget that Reagan originally was going to work with Ford. There was a plan when Reagan won the nomination to originally offer Ford the vice presidency, and they would divide up all presidential duties between the two of them, but Reagan didn't like what Ford was. Ford would want a little bit more than Reagan was willing to give, so they ended up not doing it. But yeah, Reagan certainly kind of swings into things, and definitely overshadows Ford in a lot of ways. So both are at play, I would argue.
Nice job.
Thanks, Professor Jones. Thank you. All right, so guys, change gears straight away then? All right, excellent. Well, David's thesis is tentatively titled Hilarious Hitler, Exploring Comedic Representations of Nazism and Their Political and Social Contexts. And so, as the title would suggest, he's going to examine representations of Nazism in popular culture. What he intends to argue in his thesis is that the concept of what kinds of depictions of Nazism are acceptable in American society has changed over time, over the past 73 years specifically. And one of the things he's going to start by looking at is Charlie Chaplin's famous movie, The Great Dictator, which is very, very pro-American and very, very anti-Nazi. And so David also believes that this is a great lens to look at how society has changed overall. And he believes we can decipher a great deal of information about that change by looking at the grounds of what is acceptable in the media media representations over these past 73 years. So the main research questions that he's going to look at in his thesis are, when did the grounds of acceptability and representations of Nazism shift? And more specifically, what events, both domestically and globally, affected how the American public felt about certain portrayals of Nazism and about the Holocaust? And so David hopes that by the end of writing his thesis, he will successfully have dissected a political and social history of America by using this lens of the comedic representations of Nazism and the primary sources he has going along with that, as well as public opinion about the reaction to those various representations of Nazism. So a little bit of the historiographic context for David's essay. He definitely thinks there's a need for his project because up until this time there's been no scholarly analysis of representations of Nazism in popular culture. And so he said himself in his essay that he thinks it's a very daunting task, but he's more up for the challenge, and I commend him for that. So he's going to look at why the public has avoided this complicated subject. Why is it that there really is not this historiographic analysis that a lot of the rest of us have about it around his subject? So a little bit of the relevant works. I won't go into this in insane amounts of detail. I'll present maybe enough that's just relevant really quickly. One of the first things to look at is an article about a man named John Hart. I'm sorry, is it Just? Let me make sure I got this right. It's Jost Herman and John Hartfeld. They have similar names. Which one is the one who actually was the guy, and which one's
Jost
the
Herman's the writer.
Jost Herman.
John Hartfield's the cartoonist.
Okay, so he's going to start with a guy named John Hartfield, who was a cartoonist who used kind of slapstick portrayals of Hitler and the Nazis in the Third Reich, and eventually gets banned for it. So that's kind of one of the early points, it seems, of that. Then he's looking at an article by a woman named Astrid Klock, who is going to look at how representations and satires of Nazis within The Great Dictator, so going to Charlie Chaplin's work, kind of work towards unmasking Nazis and their evil nature. I apologize. Before I go through this, I should give a little bit more of an overview of David, because what his thesis is going to do. He's got 3 basic chapters. And first, he's going to look at representations of Nazism in the Third Reich era. And that's up until the end of World War II, obviously. So The Great Dictator is going to figure very prominently in that. And he's going to highlight how it kind of follows a very rigid conviction. It's very, very harshly anti-Nazi and almost has a propaganda feel to it. And then he's going to look at representations after World War II, but before, like kind of basically during the Cold War, before the end of the fall of the Soviet Union. And there, I think he looks like he's going to expect to see a lot of the shifts in what kinds of representations are acceptable, kind of more from this harsh critique of Nazis and more propaganda, and then moving towards what we see today, which is the third chapter, which is looking at films like Life is Beautiful, looking at films like Inglourious Basterds. And I just said bastards in a very academic setting. And he's going to show how the boundaries between what is acceptable and not acceptable has shifted over this time.
I want to add one thing about chapter 2.
You'll have a chance to do that.
Oh, sorry.
And you're going to have to read that.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Continue.
With pleasure. So again, so going back, so I said Herman's article, the Das German, and then the Charlie Chaplin piece will figure prominently. Then a lot of the remaining works they have look at different scholar analysis of Life is Beautiful, and it seems like that's a very, very prominent movie and a work that he's going to be analyzing in detail because it seems to have a very comedic, I haven't seen it, but from talking with David, it's got kind of a lot of funny parts that don't seem to take the Holocaust too seriously and has a very, very sad ending. So it's sort of an interesting portrayal of still keeping the themes of the Holocaust that we all know well and alive, and yet looking at it in a positive light and showing the power of laughter. And I mean, if you guys know Viktor Frankl's Search for the Meaning of Life, I believe that's what it's pronounced. I'm sorry if I screwed that up. It's Man's Search for Meaning. Man's Search for Meaning. Kind of looking at the power of remembering your self-worth in the face of such horrible things such as the Holocaust afterwards. And yeah, and then I can go his general timeline too. David intends to basically complete his research over the summer. He's got some phenomenal avenues to do that. He's got numerous resources at the University of Michigan, ranging from Asquith to a Donald Hall's collection at North Quad, not Donald Hall's, the Donald Hall collection. And off campus, he's lucky enough to live in Southern California, and if you guys know anything about USC, USC is sort of the best place for film research. They have WB's archive, Warner Brothers archives, and numerous other film institutions. Also, additionally, Bowling Green and Michigan State both have fantastic resources that he'll be able to use to analyze film. And if I could just quickly say at the end here, just want to take time, I had a blast reading David's thesis. I think it's going to be really entertaining. It's very, very different than I think a lot of our other theses, but at the same time, like he says himself, it's something that hasn't been done before, and I think it's really cool to read that really there's not really any other analysis. He's going to be the first guy to enter this field, so I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to reading his thesis at a later point. So I will turn it over to him. He can address my mistake on chapter 2, and we can go from there.
Good, thank you. David, you're from Southern California?
Yeah. So for chapter 2, it wasn't a mistake that Chris made, it was more an omission that I made. But I've sort of decided that for chapter 2, I'm going to have it be a Mel Brooks chapter because Mel Brooks made a trio of movies in the 60s and 80s, I guess. Between the 60s and 80s. Trio of movies. You've got The Producers, came out in the 60s, and you've got Spaceballs and To Be or Not to Be, both came along later. So Mel Brooks clearly had an interest in like World War II and like Hitler and the Nazis and making fun of them. I really haven't dug into the research in this section of my thesis at all yet, but I know that that it's definitely interesting to see that Mel Brooks was almost like chronically representing the Nazis comedically during the Cold War era, and that's a theme that I'm looking to explore as I get deeper into my research. I'd now open it up to questions. Yeah.
Have you considered incorporating Monty Python at all?
I don't want to incorporate Monty Python because I'm looking to see how American reactions to certain representations have shown where we are as a society in the political contexts of these representations. I know that one of my main texts is an Italian film, Life is Beautiful, but it's a film that did very well in the US box office and eventually won a boatload of Oscars. So it still made its effect stateside, I think, a little bit stronger than maybe Monty Python does. Even though Monty Python's still very popular in the United States, I don't think it has the social effect that Mel Brooks or Life is Beautiful had.
Yeah, I actually have two questions. The first one, what kind of sources are you going to use to analyze, that you saw the American reaction to that?
Yeah.
Are you looking for?
I'm looking for newspaper, magazine, film review, things like that. There's a wide variety of resources that I've kind of discovered by working with the film librarian. who works over at Donald Hall in North Quad. And he put together a pretty unbelievable research guide where you can type in a film name and it will give you everything written regarding that film ever, like right underneath. So it's pretty cool. There's a lot of primary source material out there. And that's what I plan on spending my summer doing, is, watching movies and going through these primary sources and trying to find interesting nuggets of relevance.
Are you going to be looking at all the backgrounds of some of the directors or writers of these movies, like whether or not they're if they're Jewish or not, or if that affects how they would portray Nazis? Because I know for a fact Mel Brooks is very much Jewish.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, I actually plan on doing that, and there's another interesting angle to that. The Nazis thought Charlie Chaplin was Jewish.
Okay.
And so do a lot of people. Like, I'm just gonna say that. Like, a lot of people think Charlie Chaplin was Jewish. He wasn't. He kept that on the down low because he liked the Nazis thinking that he was Jewish when he made The Great Dictator. So I think that if you I plan on kind of coupling that with Mel Brooks and Roberto Benigni, who's also not Jewish, but feels for some reason a really close connection with the Italian Holocaust.
Okay.
Or not the Holocaust in Italy, that he decided to make a movie about it. Yeah.
What about like stand-up or like comedy that like uses Nazis as like a signifier or like mentions them, but it's not like a direct audio-visual representation like in a movie?
For now, I'm focusing on movies and TV shows, and I've got some other like Hartfield, the cartoonist that Chris was talking about. I think that his work is really interesting because it was coming from inside Nazi Germany during World War II. In terms of stand-up comedy, I don't know.
Like Nazi jokes.
Nazi jokes, like, the only problem is I think that it's an interesting idea for my thesis, but film is just, I think, a better medium through which to explore it. Like, if I'm having a hard time with film, I may try to investigate deeper into, like, Nazi jokes and stand-up comedy and stuff like that. But I think that film is better in terms of, like, what my thesis is trying to look at is what kinds of, like, factors in the outside world have affected the acceptability of certain representations of Nazism, like what you're allowed to say in society. And I think that film's like a better way of tracking that. But something that I do plan on exploring are those YouTube videos of, you guys know those YouTube videos of Downfall?
Yeah.
So that's another source that I definitely plan on examining, and how the internet, this will be a part of chapter 3 of course, but how the internet has changed how people are able to express their feelings about the Nazis, and how the anonymity of YouTube and the internet makes this like an easier task for people.
2 questions. One's just quick clarification. The Mel Brooks Producers is based off the play, right?
It was a movie first that he made, and then turned it into a play about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I was just wondering that.
Yeah, no.
The other thing I was asking, so you have like the whole focus on movies, but you're going to start with comics. So I was wondering, like, why start with comics if you're actually focused on like audio-visual representation?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's all still in the works for me. But I don't know exactly right now where, like, I know that I've got my chapters broken down into these 3 main periods. But in terms of like supplementary sources, I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to use, and like that comic would serve as like a supplementary source to like my more central texts. Another thing that I plan on doing is looking at the film To Be or Not to Be. There were 2 versions of it. One was made in 1942, and the other one in 1984. Those dates are rough, but it was something like that. And the second one was made by Mel Brooks, so that will be my Mel Brooks chapter. And I want to look at how the two films, like how they are in conversation with each other and how they are in opposition of each other, and like how they were received based on when they were released, and how like I can track why public opinion regarding the film changed in those 40 years, because the 1942 version was met with a lot of opposition, and the general consensus among scholars is that the country wasn't ready for a film like that. But the 1980s version, maybe because it was made by Mel Brooks, who's Jewish, maybe because it was years later, or a combination of all these things, was received much differently and met with little backlash.
Okay, this is just a quick technical question. I'm just curious, I think it's interesting that you get to use, visual material. So how are you going to incorporate that into your thesis and use this evidence for an audience that possibly, has not seen the film or, the visual material that you're working with?
Well, I'll describe the films. I'll give like maybe a quick plot summary. Obviously I'm not going to be able to show every movie I reference to everybody who reads my thesis, but I think that's the case with everyone's major texts. Nobody's going to be able to read through all of our secondary sources. Nobody's going to be able to listen to albums and albums of the Bakersfield Sound. So I feel like it's a problem that we all face, and it's just we have to articulate in our writing, which is why we have tons of pages to do it.
Though I think I would plant the seed, and certainly for you, and it's for Grace, but it might be for other people also, which is we're at a moment where some of you who have audio or visual material might think seriously about what it would mean to incorporate hyperlinks into a thesis. Not because you want your reader to have to watch the entire film, but could you today incorporate into a thesis a clip from a film or sound? I think we're not quite there, but that is where we're going in the field, in the sense that now that many of our journals, even our books, are e-published, even as they're published in paper versions, that the e-versions are now are opening up the possibility of a different kind of footnote, right? And the footnote, I don't think we're yet at the point where you can count on a reader to click and follow the link and watch or listen. But it doesn't mean that you might not, in a final document, in an electronic version of your final thesis, incorporate some of that material for the reader who is curious or ambitious in that way. I think that's where we're headed, slowly and with a lot of ambivalence, but I think that's where we're headed.
I want to comment one more thing about what you just said. I just wanted to say that, and I lost what I was going to say, but I'll get it back eventually. I've read a lot of secondary source material that references movies that I haven't seen, and it's not that difficult to write a paragraph or two that sort of sums up what the movie is trying to say and the importance of it. And I feel like having read the secondary source material, I sort of know how to do it now.
Thank you very much.